Hey everyone, and welcome to video 3 for chapter 30, the final video. This will be a relatively quick one as well. We're going to talk about the global effects of industrialization. So early industrialization was dominated by Western Europe and North America, right? Starting in Great Britain, spread to places like France and Germany and the United States first, and that's pretty much where it stayed for the first couple of decades. But by the late 19th century, you started to see it spread to areas in Eastern Europe and Asia. Industrialization had a huge impact on the expansion of power for these industrialized nations. Before we get to that, though, let's first look at how industrialization spread beyond the Western world with this continuing spread of industrialization. Now, by the mid-1800s, much of Western Europe was industrialized, and by the end of the century, it had spread into Asia. First area we're going to look at is Mother Russia. So the Russian government, the Russian Tsarist government, right, the imperial government, was actually very supportive of industrialization. It was not very supportive of other progressive social reforms, but they definitely wanted to industrialize. And they mostly wanted to promote industrialization to expand the railway system so they could connect the territories of the huge empire. By 1900, they had built over 36,000 miles of railroad line, including this huge Trans-Siberian line. Right, you see how it links Moscow here in the west all the way to the Pacific, okay, all the way through Siberia. It was a big undertaking, okay. A lot more railway track needed to be laid for this one than the railways connecting the eastern United States with the Pacific. Now, Russia was also a major exporter of oil in the early 20th century, and Russian steel production was only behind the major industrial powers of Britain, the United States, and Germany. It still had a lot of social problems, which we'll talk about in later chapters, but its industrial capacity was actually progressing nicely. Now, in Japan, the imperial government pushed for industrialization as well. Now, we're going to talk about the period known as the Meiji Restoration in chapter 32, but just for this purpose, know that the 1800s saw a movement to modernize Japanese industry to be more like Western powers. The government supported railroads, mines, banking expansion, and the introductions of machines and manufacturing. All right, so you saw scenes like this, that they tried to retain some of their traditional identity, but you see the railway cars, you see the steamship in the background, okay, and also you notice the Western style of dress. We'll talk more about that when we get to the Meiji Restoration. The government started up businesses, and these businesses that whether it was railroad, whether it was banking, whether it was industry of any kind, they would eventually sell them to private entrepreneurs. They would sell them to private families who then built them into industrial empires known as zaibatsu. Now, zaibatsu were similar to the cartels and trusts we talked about previously in this chapter, but they were run by a single family as opposed to corporations. Zaibatsu families sometimes owned companies in several different industries, so they were very wealthy and very powerful and influential. Some by zaibatsu families, such as Mitsubishi, are still prominent to this day, right? So they're still around. Now, the global impact of industrialization. The world was now divided between the industrialized world versus the non-industrialized world. Industrialization brought huge economic and military strength to nations that could take advantage of it, such as the United States and Great Britain. But outside of Europe, the US, and Japan, industrialization didn't have as much positive impact. It created an international division between the industrialized and non-industrialized world, mostly due to the demand for raw materials. Okay. You look on the map here. These are, as of 2002, what we would consider to be the industrialized countries. Now, you've got your classic ones here with North America and Europe and so forth. And you notice you've got a small sprinkling of some ones that we did not industrialize in the 1800s, such as China, India, Australia, Brazil, and so forth. But you also notice not much going on in the Middle East, practically nothing still going on in Africa. And this is the 21st century. So you can see how the line that divided industrialized versus non-industrialized, it has not been done away with. Okay, there's still a very distinct divide between, what now we would call the developed world versus the developing world. And again, as I said, a lot of it goes back to this demand for natural resources. Industrialization required a large amount of natural resources. Big nations like Russia and the US, they could find a lot of it within their borders, but smaller nations like Britain and Japan, they had to look beyond their borders for the supply of resources. And as industry continued to grow, even the US began to look overseas for resources. The industrialized world looked to places like Africa, Asia, South America, places like that to supply the raw materials. This in turn will lead to Western imperialism, which we'll talk about in chapter 33. Sometimes a relationship with industrialized nations led to economic development in some nations, lands like Canada, Australia, Argentina, and South Africa also saw economic growth and low, not huge, but low levels of industrializations. Most of the lands, though, were less fortunate and caught in a system of economic dependence. Now, the majority of areas in Latin America, sub-Saharan Africa, okay, this area of Africa and here, in South Asia, were forced by industrialized nations to export raw materials, but not get really anything in return. This wasn't an equal trade relationship. They sometimes became completely focused on exporting only a single product, such as rubber in the Congo, sugar in Cuba, or cotton in India. The industrialized countries forced these countries to only focus on that because that was really the only thing that the industrialized countries cared about. Plus, on top of that, foreigners usually owned the land from which the materials came from, and this system resulted in very low wages for native workers. It resulted in very little money being distributed throughout the non-industrialized societies, and it also resulted in foreign manufacturers limiting the ability for the people in these countries to own anything. It really created a situation where you're still seeing the effects of to this day. So industrialization, huge benefits for the industrialized world, but it created a tremendous amount of wealth disparity worldwide. And we'll continue to talk about those situations as we move forward. All right, so that wraps things up with industrialization. And as I said, we'll come back to some of the themes from this in later chapters.